Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and today we'll have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'll be doing my top 10 thematic board games, otherwise known as my top 10 Ameritrash games. And I'm not going to go too into the definition of that term and whether or not it's obsolete, but basically it's American style games in opposition or in contrast to European or Euro style games and the way they tend to work. So I am looking at games that are very thematically rich with lots of rich themes and intellectual properties. Even these games tend to lend themselves to very popular IPs. They have deep and rich universes. They're very story driven. Lots of narrative and reading of text takes place in these types of games. There's lots of interaction, particularly in the form of combat. So if you don't like combat, these games may or may not be for you. Also, there's lots of randomness and randomizing this game, particularly in the form of dice rolling, right? And there's other types of elements to the randomization in these games. So real quickly, I'm organizing these top 10 just straight up how much I like it, not necessarily the thematic integration or necessarily how much these games get me into the theme, but I will say this, all of these games actually do a pretty good job of getting me to the theme. Some of them are a little bit abstracted, and even so, they work or they click for me. So don't worry about all the thematic games that you see back here on my shelf of shame. They will not be on the list. They're just here to distract you. Let's get straight to it. My number 10 thematic board game of all time, or Ameritrash game, is Elder Sign. Elder Sign, designed by Richard Launius and Kevin Wilson, and published by Fantasy Flight Games within their Arkham Horror file games. And basically, this is a game that takes place within the Cthulhu mythos. We are in a museum and a bunch of investigators, and we are trying to defeat bad guys and ultimately, close all gates and portals and what have you, and collect elder signs, which are a weapon against the ancient ones before they awaken. Because once the elder ones or the ancient ones awaken, there's a good chance that you're going to lose. As a matter of fact, in the case of some of these ancient ones, you are guaranteed the loss if they awaken. So basically, this is Arkham Horror with dice rolling, kind of Yahtzee, right? So you're rolling dice and you're trying to fulfill different tasks that are found on the different cards, which basically abstractly represent the different locations within the museum, right? Very abstractly, I might say. So you are going through these different cards, and after you land on a card, you have certain combinations of dice that you're trying to roll, and you need to roll them within one roll. So if one task consists of 2 or maybe even 3 different faces of a die, you need to accomplish all of that within one roll. And what's interesting is there's lots of dice mitigation in this game. There are clue tokens, which give you the ability to re-roll. There are different types of cards that assist you. You've got common items, unique items, you've got spells, you've got allies, and all these different cards help you to some way or another to mitigate the dice rolling, either re-rolling a die or maybe changing the face of a die to a particular other face. Really, really cool. Managing all that is really interesting. There's a ton of investigators in the base game, a ton of ancient ones to fight, lots of different adventure cards, portal cards, mythos cards that all contribute to the storyline of the game. There's lots of amazing narrative text on all of these cards. So if you can actually get into it and into the reading, it will be an enjoyable experience. But if you're more of an abstracted player that just sees the mechanisms, it'll be fine too. It is a little bit Yahtzee-like, so if you like Yahtzee, it's all good. But there are some definite variations from Yahtzee. For instance, you are rolling and locking. So this is a roll and lock type of game. You roll a dice, and you have to lock at least one die. Hopefully, you're locking the dice that you need to accomplish the task. But if not, what you do is you discard a die. So it's technically a different way of locking a die. So with each subsequent roll, you are rolling less and less dice, or fewer dice. So really cool. My number 10 thematic Ameritrash board game, Elder Sign. Now let's move on to my number 9, and that is Descent, Journeys in the Dark. And this game would have been higher just a few months ago. I really do enjoy this game, but the people who I play it with have grown a little bit cold on it. So there is that. And I have to admit, what I love the most about this game is the campaign. This is an RPG dungeon crawler style of game. This is kind of like the benchmark for that style of game. There's so many out there in the market nowadays. But the cool thing about this is going from quest to quest, encounter to encounter, leveling up your characters, gaining new skills, shopping for new items. All these things are really, really interesting, and seeing the plots that develop throughout the different subsequent quests throughout the campaign. But if you look at it as a one-off game experience from game to game, I had to look at it like that and be like, you know what? I do enjoy the campaign experience, but from game to game, this is a great game, solid game in this style of thematic Ameritrash type of game, fantasy dungeon crawler. But at the same time, not good enough to make it to any higher than my number 9 thematic Ameritrash game of all time, Descent. And now we move on to my number 8. And this is a recent one for me. And I have a long history of this game, even though I've only recently been playing. Let's get to it. My number 8 is this big box right here, Star Trek Fleet Captains. And this is a game that I bought, sold after I read the rule book. Not because I read it and thought I wouldn't be interested, because after reading it, I was like, I don't think anybody I game with would be interested in this game. Nobody I game with is very much interested in the Star Trek IP, and mechanically speaking, this game is Ameritrash to its core. It's just a lot of skill tests, a lot of dice rolling going place, some conflict, some secret missions, which are a cool way of scoring victory points. And you don't necessarily win by eliminating your opposition, you win by scoring victory points. So there are some Euro type elements there, but at the same time, it just felt like nobody I knew would be interested in it. But then I saw some videos online of some very competent solo variants. I read the rules on BGG's forums, and I was like, hey, I'm going to get this, because even if I never discover another person to play with, if I can game with this solo, that's just enough for me. That's fine. So I've really been enjoying it, playing it. I've played it a good amount of times in recent weeks. And yeah, it's just such an enjoyable game. If you like the Star Trek intellectual property, a lot of these, you know, type of Ameritrash thematic games, you're not gonna like them if you don't like the theme, because the theme is what sells the game. It's probably its highest attribute, right? It's not necessarily the most mechanically sound or robust type of game. None of these games really are, or most of these games at least aren't. But their themes and how they integrate and how they immerse you into those universes or into those IPs is really the bread and butter of these games. So if you don't like Star Trek, you may not like this game. But if you do like Star Trek and you like Ameritrash or thematic style games, this is a great game to play. You have so much variability just within the base game, so many different decks of cards that you use to do a little bit of deck construction and create your command deck, as the game refers to it. And these command decks give you crew members that you add to your respective different ships, and they give you different cards that give you different abilities for different tests you're trying to do. You've got 3 different categories of missions you're trying to accomplish. You're trying to accomplish combat missions. You're trying to accomplish diplomatic or political missions, and you're trying to accomplish science missions. And depending on what faction you control, you have a certain bias or preference to one type of mission over another. For example, the Federation is very peaceful and diplomatic, so they have lots more science and diplomacy missions. The Klingons are ruthless and cutthroat, so they have much more combat missions. And you're exploring the galaxy. There's a great sense of exploration as you travel. You move your ship from tile to tile, face down tiles that you flip over, discover what's there. It might be empty space, or a class M planet that's habitable, or it might be a supernova, right? Or a black hole or a wormhole, or whatever you want to call them. All these different aspects of outer space, right? Of intergalactic, life. All of these things you encounter in these games. And speaking of encounters, every time you explore a new tile, you have to roll to see if there's an encounter. And all of these encounters, if you do engage in them, are based on actual episodes throughout all the different series of the Star Trek universe. In particular, Next Generation and the original series get highlighted a lot in this game. So if you're a fan of those old shows And again, you're interested in exploration, 4X style of games with some missions. And by the way, some of the missions are secret, so that's cool if you like the element of secrecy. Really, really neat. If you're into Star Trek, into all that other stuff, this is pretty much a game you have to try. And this is my number 7, or my number 8. My number 8 thematic Ameritrash game of all time, Star Trek Fleet Captains. And now we move on to my number 7, and that is a Game of Thrones, the card game, or the living card game, designed by Eric Lang and Nate French. And this game here is, first of all, I love the LCGs in the Fantasy Flight line of games. I think that Nate French is a genius. How many more living card games can he make? And you know, you might make the argument that he's a one-trick pony because those are the style of games he makes, but man, he has mastered that pony and he rides it like nobody else. This game is excellent. Eric Lang is involved. Eric Lang is great at thematic integration. So you got the Game of Thrones intellectual property, which I've only been exposed to recently. I watched the first season. I thought it was pretty good. Maybe not as much of a fanatic as some other people are, but I actually watched it to play this game because I was very hyped about playing this game, but I wanted to understand the IP behind it. I wanted to understand the universe behind it. I wanted to understand the intrigue and the political interactions going on among all the different houses of Westeros. So I got into it so I could play it and at the same time appreciate the game. And man, I really enjoy this game. The cool thing about this game is that lots of LCGs lend itself to two-player in a combat, right? Back and forth stuff. Sometimes maybe team versus team. But this game can play 3 or 4 players. Really, really cool. It has all the 7 houses, I believe, of Westeros are already represented in the base game. And there's tons of expansion content. And they're still publishing content for this game because it is still doing very well, which makes sense because the intellectual property is still doing very well even though the show has ended, right? So really cool. If you like a Game of Thrones, if you like games like Magic the Gathering, those style of games, this is a must try. My number 7 thematic board game of all time, a Game of Thrones, the living card game. Now we move on to my number 6, and I actually just alluded to it during my number 5, and that is MTG Magic the Gathering. And these style of games, perhaps people will disqualify them from being on this type of list, my top 10 thematic Ameritrash games. But I feel like they're very, very thematic. They have the elements of randomness, this case not necessarily with die, but with the cards you draw. Absolutely, there's a lot of thought put into deck construction or deck building, as some people might refer to it. So you build decks, and when you build your decks, you know, you have some level of control. These, for example, are pre-made decks that I work with, so I personally don't build any decks. So these are the dual decks that they sell that are asymmetric and supposed to be balanced and what have you. So really cool, really fun. I enjoy playing the game. I enjoy the idea of the combat and just trying to squeak out as much from your particular deck as you possibly can, right? Sometimes the decks are more obvious, more obviously powerful. Other decks might be more subtle and nuanced, and you have to kind of figure a way, or at least you want to figure a way to challenge yourself to master these nuances and perform as well as possible. Fun, really great, fantastical theme, great cards that are rich in their, not only their artwork, but in their presentation overall, right? Just the ideas that, you know, whether it's a spell or it's a creature, and how their stats and their special abilities and sometimes even their flavor text really brings those creatures to life, right? At least in my personal experience. My number 6 thematic Ameritrash game, Magic the Gathering. Now we move on to the top 5, the cream of the crop, the bread and butter. And my number 5 is Eldritch Horror, designed by Corey Konieska and Nikki Valens, published by Fantasy Flight Games, again in the Arkham Horror Files line of games. So this is my second Cthulhu Mythos Arkham Horror game. And yes, there are a ton of these games, especially in the Fantasy Flight catalog. These are the only 2 I played so far, and I'm sure if I played some of the others, they will contend, if not make it, onto this type of list. But for now, Eldritch Horror will be my number one. I like Elder Sign. Elder Sign definitely plays better solo. I feel that playing this solo, there's too much to cover. I have played it solo. It's cool, it's fun, but Elder Sign seems a little bit more contained, a little bit more controlled. But I would rather play this at a higher player count than Elder Sign. I'm not too sure if I want to play Elder Sign with more than 2 or 3 people. This Eldritch Horror game, I would absolutely be fine. I've played it with 4. I haven't played it with 5 yet, but I think I would be fine playing with 5. It does accommodate up to 8 players. That is a little bit crazy in my humble estimation, but this game is so cool. You are traveling through the map of the world. I love board games with maps, and this is the first game that has a map as a board, and it's the map of the entire globe, so that's even better, right? And you have all these different locations that you're trying to go to acquire clue tokens, which help you solve the different mysteries of the ancient one. You're trying to fight monsters to ultimately close gates, which are like rips within the fabric of reality, interdimensional portals through which the monsters enter our reality, and also through which the bad guy, the overlord, the ancient one, will break into our reality. And again, just like an Elder Sign, quite often we will lose, if not guarantee a loss, if the Elder One awakens. You have this doom track that advances based on certain events, and you're trying to keep it back as much as possible, and at the same time accomplish the goal of closing the gates to hold back the forces of evil, but at the same time accomplish those 3 different mystery cards that each ancient one has that you have to accomplish one by one in order to ultimately win the game. This is really cool because technically there's no player elimination in this game, because if your character or your investigator dies, all you have to do is you leave them wherever they may have, been knocked out, and then you choose a new investigator, keep on playing your game, and that character that is left in the location where they were knocked out becomes an encounter you could have in a future or subsequent turn, where based on whether he died physically or just went insane, you will have an encounter with him or her, and you will acquire all of their possessions, all of the items that they may have had, the weapons they may have had, the allies they may have had, the clue tokens they may have acquired throughout the game, the artifacts. All of these become yours, so you don't feel like you totally wasted in the investment of these characters. So I find that to be really, really cool. However, if you run through all the investigators, that is one of the ways that you lose the game. And of course, you got the Mythos deck, which adds lots of, first of all, progression to the game. It progresses evil, but it also adds lots of narrative. There's events that happen every time you flip over a Mythos card that progresses the game one way or another, and more often than not is detrimental to the investigators. Also, you're having encounters. Each player is having an encounter from every round, and all of these encounters are rich, not only in thematic narrative, but they're also rich in decision making. Quite often you find some decisions you have to make or some skill tests that you must pass in order to resolve these encounters. Really cool game. My number 5, thematic Ameritrash game of all time, Eldritch Horror. Now we move on to my number 4, and very much like Magic the Gathering and Game of Thrones, we've got Android Netrunner. Originally designed by Richard Garfield of Magic the Gathering fame, but this design is kind of revamped by Lucas Litzinger and Fantasy Flight Games. And this is my favorite game of these style of games. Again, some people might feel like these type of games are disqualified from this type of list, but I don't think so. These are really cool thematic games. Here in this case, you have this futuristic dystopia where you have these evil corporations running different, companies, and you have the Netrunners, as the name indicates, Android Netrunner, the Netrunners who are trying to hack into these different systems, right? And break into them and steal their agendas, right? Each of these corporations have a bunch of agendas that they're trying to accomplish, and if they accomplish it, they're the winner, right? That's one player. One player takes the agenda, the corporation side. But the Netrunners trying to destroy or capture, steal those agendas before they can be accomplished. Really cool, very asymmetric, perhaps to a fault, because even the terminology from one side versus the other differs, even when it's referring to the same aspects of gameplay. And again, I think it's just a an idea behind the publishers to make the game feel more thematic, right? So I think it's really, really cool. There's a lot of, bluffing and playing a game of chicken, but at the same time, just trying to anticipate your opponent. There's hardly any luck in this game except for the card drawing, which is enough to make it qualify for this game. My number 4 thematic Ameritrash game of all time, Android Netrunner. And now we move on to my number 3. And my number 3 is a game that I love, and that is Runebound 3rd edition. And this is another revamping from the same guy I just mentioned right now of a previous edition of this game, and that is Lucas Litzinger. And again, this is Fantasy Flight Games. Lots of these games are Fantasy Flight Games. As you can see, Fantasy Flight is probably the king of the hill as far as thematic games are concerned. They're probably the top dog as far as, locking in licenses for different intellectual properties, and this right here is actually their own IP back before they kind of went on that route of tapping into the rich wealth of different intellectual properties that are out there and acquiring all these licenses. They created their own IP with Runebound and the Terranoff universe. And in this game, basically each player is a different hero, a character with different stats, different attributes, different skills, different weapons. And they're going through the lands of Terranoff. And basically you have about, I think it's 24 turns to level up your character before you have to fight the Overlord. And there's 2 Overlords in the base game. You got Margath the Dragon, and you've got Vorakesh the Necromancer. And basically, and they all add different storyline cards to the game, different encounter cards in the game. So each mastermind, aside from the fact that they themselves are different, add a lot of difference and variability to the game. But you're trying to level up your character in 24 turns, and you're doing so by acquiring different weapons, going to the cities, getting gold, so you can shop for these different weapons or equipment or clothing even, right? Different items that will empower you in order to face this big, bad, boss of a character at the end of the game. You also are going to different encounters. In particular, you're having combat encounters with smaller, weaker bad guys who, if you defeat them, you gain a reward. You gain them as a trophy. You gain gold coins, which you could use later to go to shop and acquire more items. You're also training and acquiring different skills that improve you as a player, increase your attributes, give you some special combat abilities. Really, really cool, really neat. The narrative, again, is amazing in this game. Every single space on this board is comprised of a bunch of hexagonal spaces. Every space has relevancy to the overall story that this game is trying to depict. And finally, you get to fight the bad guy. Quite often you lose, but it's always so exciting to wonder and speculate as to whether or not you're going to be powerful enough to defeat the bad guy. My number 3 thematic Ameritrash game of all time, Runebound 3rd edition. And now we're going to move on to my number 2, and this is where you guys are going to flip out. This is where you guys are going to jump down my throat and say that I am a hack and that I am a cheater, but I will strongly defend myself in a court of law if I must. My number 2 thematic board game of all time is Runebound 2nd edition, folks. And no, you do not have to rewind the video. I will save you the trouble. My 3rd game was Runebound 3rd edition. And this game, first of all, these games are different enough and that it's warranted. It's absolutely fair and justifiable for me to include both of them on this list. As a matter of fact, you should check out, I just posted a video comparing the 2 games, a thorough comparison between Runebound 2nd edition and 3rd edition to show how the 2 games differ from one another, making some contrasts and comparisons and showing how I feel about them. So, Runebound 2nd edition, this is designed by Martin Wallace, and he also had help from Daryl Hardy, as opposed to Lucas Litzinger. And there's lots of differences in this game. First of all, the main difference in this game, I'm going to say, is the combat. The combat is totally different, and that is what gives this game the edge over Runebound. You are exploring the same lands of Terranoff. This board has more cities to shop in than Runebound 3rd edition does, but it also has different ally cards. You can acquire allies in this game. In Runebound 3rd Edition, you've got weapons, equipment, clothing, and all these different things, but you never got allies, actual personal characters that join your band and help you fight the baddies. And it's so cool because every time you interact with an encounter, a combat encounter, you fight these monsters, and they all have 3 different stats. They have, just like the heroes, this is an example of a hero card, you have mind, body, and spirit. And these actually correspond not only to the different skill tests you're going to have, but to the combat in 3 different styles of combat. You've got range corresponding with the mind, you've got melee corresponding with the body, and you've got magic corresponding with the spirit. And the way it works is every time you engage in a combat with a monster or a bad guy, you're going to fight in all 3 of these categories, in all 3 of these arenas. And it's going to go from left to right. You're going to execute the magic for the range first, then the melee, and then the magic. And what's interesting is the hero can only choose to attack in one of those 3 categories. The other 2 categories, the most that the hero could do is roll to defend. And as long as their roll of the die combined with their modifier for their attributes, as long as that total equals to or surpasses the enemy's number in that specific attribute, as long as it matches or surpasses it, we will endure their attack and not suffer any casualties, not suffer any wounds, right? So how can you optimize the beating of these bad guys? Well, very simple. You need to acquire allies, because an ally can attack in one of those 3 categories. And you can never have more than 2 allies. But if you have 2 allies, those 2 allies, along with your hero, will make sure that you can actually attack in all 3 categories. And by doing so, you give yourself a good chance of dealing damage in all 3 categories and killing these bad guys quicker and more efficiently, right? So that is so important to the game. Another really cool thing about this game is that it has this ticking time bomb that serves as the end game trigger of the game, right? You cannot just indefinitely build your characters. In Runebound 3rd Edition, you had a very arbitrary ending. It just was 24 rounds, 2 acts of 12 rounds each, and then the game is over. Here, you have what's called the Doom track, and the Doom track progresses according to how many adventure cards actually get discarded. So the more encounters you have, and the more you're discarding of cards, maybe you have a trophy and you choose to discard it, or an event card gets discarded, or a quest card is used up and it's discarded, or again, even just a enemy that you're defeating gets discarded. As these cards discard, they build up on the Doom track, and after a certain threshold, you put 1 Doom token on the Doom track. And once there's 8 tokens on that Doom track, that triggers the end of the game, and each player has exactly 1 more opportunity to run through the red encounter deck, or the red adventure deck, which is the toughest deck of them all, and has Margath the dragon, High Lord Margath, as one of the cards in there. And basically they have to, they either have to beat 3 regular bosses or 3 regular bad guys from that deck, or beat Margath. And they got to keep on drawing through the deck until they have done that, or until they're knocked out and they lose the game. So I think it's cool to just manage that, try to mitigate as much as possible and slow down the advancement of the Doom track. And in the meantime, build up your character as much as possible. There's some really cool leveling up in this game, even cooler, I think, than Runebound 3rd Edition. And there's tons of content, albeit out of print. I did get this game. It's one of my Grail games. I got it for a pretty good price, used obviously, but with 6 small expansions included, so I am not complaining. My number 2 thematic Ameritrash game of all time, Runebound 2nd Edition. Forgive me, folks. And now we move on to my number 1, and my number 1 is Summoner Wars. And again, lots of these style of games, Game of Thrones the card game, Android Netrunner, Magic the Gathering, these style of games just speak to me. Again, the fantastical theme is amazing, beautifully executed. But what I love about this game, it definitely makes it feel even more Ameritrash than all these card games, because some of these card games, you guys might argue that they're not random enough, perhaps, to fall into this list. This game, on top of the deck construction and the management of your hand of cards or your deck of cards, you also have dice rolling for combat. And it's so cool and so simple because, simply put, if you want to hit an opponent, you have to be within range, or if it's a melee character, you have to be next to them, adjacent to them. And then you roll the die, and only a 5 or a 6 counts as a hit, right? I believe it's 5 and 6. Yeah. No. I think, is it 3, 4, 5, and 6? Sorry, guys. Somebody will correct me in the comments down below. But the point is, it's a very clean system to hit, and a very generous. I think it is 5 and 6. I think you have a 1 out of 3 chance. But again, it's really, really cool. The manipulation. This is a spatial game because yes, you have cards just like in Magic the Gathering, but these cards actually move through a grid, a grid of spaces that makes up your board, in order to get into proximity with your opponent, in order to get adjacent to a wall or what have you, to block them off from being able to summon. Every time you defeat a bad guy, they become magic in your magic pile, so they become like a currency of sorts that you use along with other cards from your own deck that you add to your magic pile. And you use these cards in order to summon characters, Summoner Wars. You cannot just summon them for free. And each character, based on how valuable they are, has a different price as to how you can summon them. So just managing that, budgeting, all of that stuff, factoring in your magic pile and what you got to do to acquire more magic. And do I want to keep this card? It's pretty good, but if I add it to my magic pile, I'll be able to afford this other card and summon it next turn. Balancing all of that out, manipulating the spatial element with it, and at the same time, just all the cool and pretty asymmetric special abilities that the different races, the different factions, and the different characters provide for you make this an excellent thematic Ameritrash experience. My #1 thematic board game of all time, Summoner Wars. And that's it, folks. Thank you so much for joining us. Comment down below. Tell me what you think. What do you think about the games that I posted? What's your favorite thematic game of all time? This is Harry from When Harry Met Board Games saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.